Imagine the autumn of 1859. The United States is just, well, standing on the precipice of a massive, terrifying rupture.
Right, sectional tensions are just boiling over everywhere.
Exactly. The political system is completely fracturing, and the air is thick with the anticipation of a civil war. But out west, like in San Francisco, there's this incredibly official, incredibly grand document circulating through the muddy streets.
Oh, yeah.
And it reads like this. And you really have to picture the brass fanfares and the, throat-clearing ceremony as you hear these words. Okay, let's unpack this. It says, Norton I, by the grace of God, Emperor of these United States, being satisfied that the Republic is hopelessly ungovernable, does hereby dissolve the Congress of the United States and commands the army to clear the halls in Washington.
What's fascinating here is the sheer audacity of it. I mean, it is a stunning piece of political theater. If you analyze the syntax, it has all the cadence of a European royal decree, right?
It really does.
It projects this absolute, unquestionable authority of a monarch who just looks at the bureaucratic, bitter mess of a failing republic and simply decides, he is fed up with it.
Yeah, you read that text in isolation, and you immediately think you're looking at a coup, like a massive historical pivot point. But then, abruptly, the grand music stops.
Yeah.
Because the Congress, as you might have noticed from your history books, was not dissolved in 1859.
No, definitely not.
The Army did not march on Washington to drag the representatives out of the Capitol building.
Yeah, the machinery of the United States government remained entirely undisturbed.
And the reason for that is that the author of this decree, His Imperial Majesty Norton I, had absolutely no army.
Nothing.
He had no government apparatus.
Yeah.
He had zero capital, and he wielded literally no actual geopolitical power whatsoever.
Right.
What he had was a frayed, secondhand army coat with some, tarnished gold epaulettes. He had a beaver hat with a plume, a walking cane, and, well, he had a city.
And this is where the historical anomaly begins. History is saturated with accounts of individuals who experience a profound break from reality and subsequently declare themselves to be kings or prophets or deities, right?
Oh, sure.
The archives are full of those tragic psychological shatters. But what makes this specific narrative a complete historical marvel is the environmental reaction.
Yeah.
This is the story of a brawling, greedy, spectacularly cutthroat gold rush-era San Francisco that looked at this penniless, delusional man in a makeshift costume and collectively decided to let him reign. For 21 years.
They just said yes to all of it. Oh. Our mission today on this deep dive is to step away from the grim historical postmortems we usually do.
Yeah, that's it.
We aren't analyzing a tragedy or solving a mystery. We are pulling from historical accounts, newspaper archives, and actual United States Census records to explore the mechanics of a societal choice. We're looking at a moment when a hyper-competitive, deeply flawed community decided to co-author a kinder, far more whimsical reality.
It requires us to look at the sociology of play versus pragmatism. I mean, we live in an era currently that is fiercely obsessed with optimization, with enforcing a very specific, rigid adherence to a shared productive reality. So we're going to explore the underlying mechanisms of a time when an entire city enthusiastically chose to participate in a grand, benevolent illusion. They chose affection over institutionalization, and the reasons why they did that reveal a lot about the human need for shared mythology.
So to really understand the emperor, we first have to understand Joshua Abraham Norton. And his trajectory starts in the Great Boom of 1849. But he didn't arrive in California with a tin pan and a pickaxe, hoping to get lucky in a freezing river.
Oh, far from it. Norton arrived from South Africa, though he was originally born in England, already operating from a position of massive leverage.
Right.
When he disembarked in San Francisco in 1849, he brought with him a substantial inheritance. The historical consensus puts his capital at around $40,000.
Wow. In a boom town where, an apple could cost the equivalent of a day's wages in gold dust, $40,000 was an absolute war chest.
It was astronomical.
He was instantly thrust into the upper echelons of the city's financial elite.
And he was perfectly positioned to exploit the specific economic volatility of the 1850s. San Francisco, during this period, was experiencing hyper-capitalism in its rawest, most aggressive form. I mean, the city was physically burning down and being rebuilt from the ashes every few months.
Yeah, just chaos.
Complete chaos, and the population was exploding. Norton didn't bother going to the gold fields to extract wealth. He stayed in the city and extracted wealth from the people extracting the gold.
Smart.
He leveraged his initial capital into real estate and high-demand commodities. He quickly established himself as a merchant prince, a highly prosperous, respected, deeply grounded citizen of the establishment.
He was the guy you went to for a solid, reliable joint venture. He was compounding his wealth aggressively, but then he executes a maneuver that fundamentally breaks his entire existence.
Yeah.
We are going to look closely at the mechanics of this, because it wasn't a slow decline. It was a catastrophic, instantaneous wipeout. It's like someone today taking their entire life savings, putting it on a single, highly volatile tech stock just before an earnings call and watching the company immediately go bankrupt.
Those were perfect analogy.
He took everything he had built, all that leverage, all that real estate, and he bet it on a single commodity, rice.
Specifically, Peruvian rice. And to understand the logic of this catastrophic bet, we have to look at the macroeconomic picture of the 1850s. San Francisco was uniquely vulnerable.
Right.
It was an isolated boomtown, heavily reliant on global Pacific maritime trade networks. During this specific window, a severe famine was devastating China. Consequently, the Chinese population in San Francisco, which was substantial and growing rapidly, faced an abrupt, critical shortage of their primary staple food.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so the price of rice in the city skyrocketed practically overnight. The demand curve went vertical, and the supply was non-existent.
So Norton sees this extreme market imbalance, and his instinct isn't philanthropic.
Yeah.
His instinct is predatory. He decides to corner the market. He receives intelligence that a ship is approaching the harbor loaded with Peruvian rice, and he moves to acquire the entire cargo.
Right.
He signs contracts committing his entire fortune, everything he has leveraged, to controlling the absolute supply of rice in the city.
It is essential to recognize the ruthlessness of this action. When we talk about Emperor Norton later, we focus on his saintly benevolence. But Joshua Norton the merchant was operating as an apex predator in a completely unregulated market.
Yeah, for sure.
Cornering a staple food market during a famine is a brutal, classic monopoly play. If his timing had been right, he would have effectively become an oligarch, holding the entire city's rice supply hostage for exorbitant profit.
But operating on 19th century maritime information networks is incredibly dangerous. You don't have real-time data. You don't know what is just over the horizon. And the mechanics of his ruin are almost poetic in their timing. The very ink is drying on the contracts. He has locked up all his capital in this single ship, and the horizon fills with sails.
A cascade of ships, vessel after vessel, all loaded with rice from various ports, flooding into the San Francisco harbor.
Unbelievable. The information asymmetry that he thought he was exploiting completely collapsed. The market was instantly saturated. The scarcity that drove the price up vanished in a matter of hours, and the value of his investment plummeted to essentially zero.
Yeah.
He was holding a massive, hyperinflated asset that was suddenly completely worthless.
And he didn't just accept the loss. He attempted to void the original contract, arguing the quality of the rice was subpar, which triggered a massive, protracted legal battle. The lawsuit dragged on for years, burning through whatever residual capital he had left.
Oh, man.
The courts ultimately ruled against him. The combination of the market crash and the aggressive litigation stripped him of every last cent. The banks foreclosed on his real estate, his business partners abandoned him, his social standing evaporated.
So by the late 1850s, the wealthy, respected Joshua Norton is entirely bankrupt. And the historical record goes dark. He simply vanishes from public life.
Yes.
For a couple of years, this pillar of the financial community is a ghost. He steps completely out of the narrative.
That absence is deeply significant from a psychological perspective. The boom and bust cycle of the gold rush was extraordinarily traumatizing. Men who built empires saw them vaporize in an afternoon.
Right.
The suicide rate was astronomical. People simply could not process the psychological shatter of moving from massive leveraged power to absolute destitution overnight. Norton experienced a total annihilation of his identity.
Yeah.
Joshua Norton, the merchant prince, was dead. The man who survived that collapse was fundamentally broken, and he had to retreat into the shadows to somehow reassemble an ego that could survive.
And the way he put the pieces back together resulted in a completely new psychological architecture. On September 17th, 1859, the ghost returns to the city. Norton walks into the offices, the San Francisco Daily Evening Bulletin. He doesn't have the fine clothes anymore. He's visibly impoverished. But he walks directly up to the editor, George Fitch, and he hands over a piece of paper. And that paper is the proclamation we read at the top of the show, declaring himself Emperor of these United States.
Just picture the sheer audacity of that scene. A destitute, ruined man walking into a chaotic, ink-stained newspaper office, surrounded by the noise of a rough boomtown, and with absolute serene, unshakable conviction, submitting a document that overthrows the democratic system of the republic and installs himself as an absolute monarch.
My immediate reaction when looking at this is to question the mechanics of the newspaper's response. I mean, if a man walks into a major publication today and declares himself the Emperor of North America, he is politely escorted to the sidewalk by building security.
Yeah, absolutely.
He certainly doesn't get published. Why did the bulletin give him the ink?
Well, to understand that, you have to dissect the media ecosystem of the 1850s. 19th century newspapers were not the staid, objective institutions we conceptualize today.
Yeah.
They were highly sensationalist, fiercely competitive, and they actively blurred the line between news and entertainment. The editor looked at Norton's proclamation and immediately saw the comedic value. They printed it purely as an amusement, assuming their readership would appreciate the absurdity of this fallen local capitalist abruptly claiming the throne of the nation.
So they viewed it as a cynical, one-off joke, like a funny little column filler to break up the shipping news and the political arguments.
Precisely. It was meant to be a disposable piece of local color. But the societal reaction completely bypassed the newspaper's cynical intentions. The joke escaped the page and mutated into something profound.
The public grabbed onto it. They didn't just laugh at him. They felt this strange, protective affection for the persona he'd created. And Norton didn't just claim the title and retreat to his room. He actively governed.
He really did.
Over the course of his 21-year reign, he issued roughly 500 decrees. And these were not subtle suggestions. They were sweeping, unilateral actions.
He fundamentally believed in his mandate. He was acting with the absolute authority he felt he possessed.
Let's look at one of the most famous examples. In 1869, he issued a decree officially abolishing both the Democratic and Republican parties.
Yes.
Now, as we discuss this, we are impartially reporting the historical facts of his reign. We are not endorsing his actions or taking any modern political sides whatsoever. This is purely an examination of his imperial logic. He looked at the bitter, violent partisanship of the era, the political gridlock, and he just decided to unilaterally dismantle the entire apparatus.
It's a fascinating window into his analytical framework. He believed his primary responsibility was to the stability and welfare of the nation. To his mind, the two-party system was causing the instability, so the most logical, efficient solution for a monarch was to simply outlaw the factions. But the brilliance of his reign wasn't just in what he tried to destroy, it was in what he tried to build. If we connect this to the bigger picture, you realize how shockingly visionary he was regarding infrastructure and geopolitics.
That is the element that completely subverts your expectations. You assume you are reading the ramblings of a broken mind, and then you hit a decree that makes perfect pragmatic sense.
Exactly. He issued repeated, highly specific decrees commanding the immediate construction of a suspension bridge and a tunnel linking San Francisco to Oakland across the bay.
Which in the 1860s and 70s sounded like absolute science fiction to the people reading it. Spanning the San Francisco Bay with a suspension bridge was considered an engineering impossibility. People thought it was the funniest, most delusional thing he had ever written.
Yet his understanding of the region's geographical destiny and its future infrastructural bottlenecks was flawless. Decades after his death, the state of California built the Bay Bridge and the Trans-Bay Tube, and they built them almost exactly along the alignments that Emperor Norton had mandated.
It's just wild. And his vision wasn't localized just to transit. In 1869, the emperor issued a decree calling for the formation of a League of Nations. He explicitly mandated a global assembly where international disputes could be mediated through diplomacy and arbitration rather than armed conflict. He is conceptualizing a global peacekeeping body decades before Woodrow Wilson, well before the devastation of World War I made it a grim necessity.
That specific decree highlights the deep tragedy and the isolated brilliance of his intellect. His psychological grip on reality regarding his own personal identity and status was completely shattered.
Right.
But his analytical mind, his ability to observe systemic, macro-level problems, whether it was the friction of regional transit or the inevitability of global conflict, and synthesize highly logical solutions, was completely intact. He was actively diagnosing the flaws in the world around him.
Yeah, we do have to navigate a historical minefield here for you. Because Norton became such a massive, beloved figure, the local newspapers quickly realized that any content featuring Emperor Norton moved units. It sold papers.
Right. And when reality couldn't supply enough decrees, the editors simply manufactured them.
Exactly. We have to separate the actual emperor from the fan fiction. Many of the decrees printed in the papers were complete forgeries, written by bored or cynical editors, putting words in his mouth for a laugh.
The most prominent example of this is the legendary decree where Emperor Norton supposedly imposed a mandatory $25 fine on anyone caught uttering the word Frisco to describe the city.
It is arguably the most famous thing associated with him today. I mean, you could buy T-shirts with that decree on it right now.
You can, but historically it is almost certainly apocryphal. It was an invention of the press.
Right.
But even the forgeries are sociologically important because they demonstrate how deeply the community had integrated him into their shared identity. The newspapers were collectively crowdsourcing a local mythology. But the verified, authentic decrees like the bridge and the dissolution of the parties are profound enough on their own.
So let's look at the daily mechanics of this localized empire. What did it actually look like to inhabit Emperor Norton's San Francisco? Because his reign wasn't abstract, it was tactile. You would be walking down Montgomery Street and you would see the emperor conducting his business.
Visually, he was unmistakable. His uniform began as that very worn, secondhand army coat. But over the years, as the city began to actively invest in his reality, the wardrobe became far more elaborate. The heavy gold epaulettes he wore, for instance, were not scavenged. They were formally gifted to him by respectful United States military officers stationed at the local presidio.
Wait, the actual military establishment was subsidizing the uniform of a man claiming to be their supreme commander?
Yes.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
He also wore a prominent beaver hat, usually adorned with a rosette or a peacock feather, and he always utilized a heavy walking cane or a brightly colored umbrella. These weren't just accessories. They were his regalia. They were his scepter and crown.
His routine was highly regimented. He did not behave like a vagrant wandering aimlessly. He was a head of state conducting daily inspections of his domain.
Right.
He would meticulously patrol the streets, examining the condition of the paving, inspecting the newly constructed cable car lines to ensure they met his safety standards, and scrutinizing the progress of any public works or construction sites.
If a crew was laying a new sidewalk, the emperor would inevitably stop, lean heavily on his cane, and observe the work. And the workers didn't shoo him away.
No, they didn't.
They engaged with him. They treated his oversight with a mixture of amusement and genuine respect. He had reserved complimentary seating at all the major local theaters. If a new production opened in San Francisco, Emperor Norton was in the audience. And it wasn't uncommon for the crowd to rise in acknowledgement when he entered the auditorium.
He also viewed himself as the ultimate moral and civic patriarch of the city. He was constantly eager to lecture citizens, politicians, and police officers on matters of philosophy, statecraft, and public morality. He genuinely felt the weight of responsibility for the spiritual and physical upkeep of San Francisco.
And this brings us to the sociological mechanism that I find absolutely staggering. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. It is one thing for a community to offer a harmless eccentric a free theater ticket, or to respectfully nod when he critiques a paving stone. It is an entirely different level of commitment to allow that eccentric into the actual functional economy of the city.
Yeah, that's a huge leap.
Norton realized that an empire requires a treasury, and he was completely destitute. So he executed a breathtaking financial maneuver. He began issuing his own fiat currency.
He engaged local printers, specifically the firm of Cuddy and Hughes, to print official promissory notes from the imperial treasury, usually in denominations of 50 cents.
And the mind-bending reality is that he used them, and the city accepted them. Emperor Norton would walk into a restaurant, consume a meal, and hand the proprietor a piece of paper he had effectively counterfeited in the name of a non-existent empire. And the restaurant owner would take it, place it in the register, and consider the debt settled.
This specific phenomenon requires us to really examine the philosophy of money. We often take for granted that currency only has value because a massive centralized government apparatus backs it with gold reserves or military force.
Right.
But at its core, any currency is simply a localized network of trust. In the highly localized, relatively isolated microeconomy of 1860s San Francisco, the community collectively agreed that Emperor Norton's cultural capital, his civic utility, was valuable enough to effectively backstop a small, informal currency. They essentially chose to monetize their own civic amusement.
It's an incredible localized trust network. He was also actively collecting taxes from his subjects, right?
Yes, taxation was a formalized part of his routine. He would visit banks, merchant houses, and various businesses, and he would assess a small tax or request a loan to sustain the imperial treasury.
Okay.
We are usually talking about $1 or two. And the financial elite of the city men who had cut your throat over a gold claim happily paid it.
But why? I refuse to believe it was just pure altruism from cutthroat capitalists. There had to be a mechanism behind it.
Oh, there was. It functioned as a highly visible form of civic patronage. When a business paid the emperor's tax, they received his imperial endorsement.
Ah,
In an environment as intensely competitive as boomtown San Francisco, being publicly patronized by the city's most famous, universally beloved figure was actually highly effective marketing. It was a tangible civic flex. It demonstrated that your business was established, successful, and woven into the cultural fabric of the city.
it was essentially the 19th century equivalent of paying an influencer for an endorsement. He even developed an official media apparatus to broadcast these endorsements and decrees. The Pacific Appeal, a prominent and highly respected Black-owned newspaper in San Francisco, proudly adopted the role of his official imperial organ. They published his writings, giving him the precise editorial dignity you would afford a visiting head of state.
And this collective participation inevitably bled into the official, rigid bureaucracy of the actual government.
Right.
In the modern era, we rely on bureaucratic documentation to establish objective reality. If it is recorded on a federal form, we consider it to be functionally true.
Right. The paperwork is the ultimate arbiter of reality.
Well, during the 1870 United States Census, a federal enumerator arrived at Joshua Norton's residence. And it's important to note, this residence was a very stark 9-foot by 6-foot room in a cheap working-class lodging house on Commercial Street.
Pretty grim.
The enumerator sat down and went through the standard demographic questions. And when they reached the question regarding occupation, the official legal record of the United States government recorded Joshua Norton's profession with absolute bureaucratic earnestness as emperor.
That's amazing. A federal agent looking at a man living in a tiny, impoverished room legally certified him as the emperor of the country. It is such a profound collision of objective poverty and subjective wealth.
It reveals the depth of the collective authorship taking place. The city wasn't just tolerating a nuisance on the periphery of society. The entire infrastructure of San Francisco, the media, the theaters, the restaurants, the capitalist elite, the working class, and eventually the federal bureaucracy were all actively collaborating to write and sustain a benevolent fiction.
Yeah.
They built an entire alternative reality to shelter a man who could not survive the actual one.
But the tension of any beautiful fiction is that the rigid, unforgiving rules of the real world eventually try to assert themselves. And this communal illusion was destined to be tested by the machinery of the state.
The catalyst for that test occurred in 1867.
By 1867, the emperor has been a fixture on the streets for about 8 years. He is deeply woven into the daily rhythm of San Francisco. But the city is not static. It is constantly absorbing new arrivals, people who have not been assimilated into the unspoken cultural agreements of the town.
Right.
And one of these new variables is a rookie patrol officer.
An officer named Armand Barbier. He is patrolling the streets, and he encounters Norton. Barbier does not see the beloved, culturally vital emperor that the rest of the city sees. He applies a rigid, clinical, institutional lens.
Yeah.
He sees an impoverished vagrant dressed in a bizarre amalgamation of military refuse, who is openly suffering from grand delusions.
He looks at Norton and sees a liability, someone who fails to meet the standard metrics of a productive, rational citizen. So the rookie officer acts according to the strict, unyielding letter of the law. He arrests him.
Yeah.
He takes Emperor Norton into custody with the explicit, documented intention of having him involuntarily committed to a state mental asylum.
If you look at this purely through the lens of 19th century legal and medical frameworks, Officer Barbier was executing standard operating procedure. But he was fundamentally illiterate to the sociology of the city he was hired to protect.
Totally.
The public reaction to this arrest was not relief that the streets were being cleaned up. When the news hit the telegraph wires and the evening editions that the emperor had been arrested and was facing the asylum, the city absolutely detonated.
It was an instantaneous cross-class uprising. The newspapers immediately pivot from lighthearted amusement to absolute scorching fury. The editorials published the next morning were merciless, demanding accountability from the police department.
Yeah.
The public was visibly vocally outraged.
The blowback was so severe and so unified across every demographic, from the wealthy merchants to the dock workers, that it immediately escalated to the highest levels of municipal power. The chief of police, Patrick Crowley, recognized instantly that a catastrophic political and cultural error had been committed. He bypassed the entire judicial process, personally intervened, and ordered Norton's immediate release. Furthermore, the chief of police issued a formal, deeply apologetic public statement directly to the emperor.
Imagine the sociological weight of that. It's like a modern city rioting because someone towed the local mascot's car, but so much deeper. The chief of police publicly humbling himself before a destitute man who technically lived in a flophouse,
Yeah.
all because a rookie cop tried to enforce the actual law.
Yeah.
It reveals the exact hierarchy of power in the city. The community's shared mythology completely overpowered the state's institutional logic.
This incident is the defining crucible of Norton's reign. This was the exact moment San Francisco consciously and formally chose its emperor. They were presented with the institutional option, the cold, clinical, and historically brutal reality of a 19th century psychiatric asylum, and they forcefully rejected it.
Yeah, they chose play, they chose kindness.
They chose community care over institutionalization. They chose to integrate the abnormal rather than exile it. From that day forward, an unspoken but fiercely enforced mandate existed within the police department. You do not touch the emperor. In fact, it became standard practice for police officers to stop and offer a formal salute when Norton passed them on the street.
That level of protective, localized grace is incredibly moving. But we cannot analyze the sociology of 1870s San Francisco without addressing the profound, terrifying hypocrisy that existed alongside it. The city was not a utopia of enlightened tolerance.
Far from it. The historical context of this era introduces a deeply somber, violent reality. If we are analyzing the city's capacity for kindness toward a white, European-born eccentric, we must simultaneously examine its capacity for systemic cruelty toward others. Throughout the 1870s, San Francisco was engulfed in vicious, highly organized, and politically sanctioned anti-Chinese agitation.
Yeah, the macroeconomics had shifted again. The post-war economy was experiencing severe downturns, labor was cheap, unemployment was rising, and the white working-class population violently scapegoated the Chinese immigrant community.
Right.
We are talking about horrific systemic racism.
Yeah.
There were lynch mobs, businesses were burned, and massive riots were organized with the explicit goal of terrorizing the Chinese population.
It was a profoundly dark and ugly period. Political figures like Dennis Kearney and organizations like the Working Men's Party of California were actively building political power on the slogan, "The Chinese must go." They were inciting the masses to commit acts of horrific violence against the vulnerable neighborhoods.
And what is vital to understand is where Emperor Norton positioned himself during this violence. He was universally known as a staunch, vocal defender of the Chinese resident.
He really was.
Now, I have to clarify the historical record here. There is a legendary story that is often repeated in San Francisco lore. It claims that during a particularly violent anti-Chinese riot, Emperor Norton stepped directly into the path of a bloodthirsty mob, bowed his head, and began reciting the Lord's Prayer over and over until the rioters felt a deep sense of shame, dropped their weapons, and dispersed.
It is an incredibly cinematic, powerful image. But rigorous historical analysis suggests that this specific dramatic confrontation is likely a myth, or at least heavily embellished. It perfectly aligns with the Christ-like mythology the city was building around him, which is why it became canon.
Right. The Lord's Prayer incident might be apocryphal, but the core ideological stance behind it was completely authentic. Norton's deep sympathies for the Chinese community and his absolute public refusal to align with the racial hatred of the era were very real. He utilized his platform, his decrees, to demand an immediate end to the violence. He ordered the courts to enforce equal protection under the law for Chinese residents. In his deeply principled, delusional framework, an emperor is mandated to protect all of his subjects with equal ferocity, regardless of race.
This raises an important question, though, and brings us to the profound philosophical paradox at the center of this history. We have to sit with the deep, unsettling irony of this era. You have a society comprised of successful businessmen, elected politicians, and law enforcement officers who are considered legally and functionally sane.
Right.
Yet this sane society is eagerly participating in completely irrational, destructive, and horrific racial violence. And simultaneously, the same society is lovingly protecting a penniless man whom they have legally and medically classified as a madman.
It forces you to completely deconstruct the definition of sanity. If you look at the empirical actions of the people involved in the context of the 1870s riots, who was actually exhibiting a firm grasp on morality and reason. The delusional emperor who was preaching tolerance, demanding civic peace, and recognizing the fundamental humanity of a persecuted minority, or the rational politicians leading the lynch mobs.
It's a devastating indictment of the era's moral compass. Society's definition of sanity was entirely predicated on conformity to the dominant power structure, regardless of how corrupt or violent that structure was.
Yeah.
Norton's psychological architecture regarding his personal identity was undoubtedly fractured, but his moral and ethical architecture was significantly more intact and significantly more advanced than the sane leaders of the city. He lacked any actual power, but he possessed a deep, unshakable decency.
But even an emperor, regardless of his decency, is bound by biology. After 21 years of daily inspections, 500 decrees, and an entire localized reality built around his existence, the reign finally reaches its conclusion. We arrive at the final act of the narrative.
The physical collapse occurs on a bleak, rain-swept evening, January 8, 1880.
Norton is in his early 60s, though the physical toll of his life makes him appear much older. He is dressed in his imperial uniform, which, despite the city's contributions, has grown increasingly threadbare and fragile. He is walking to the Hastings Society, a prominent local debate club, where he is scheduled to deliver a lecture on matters of state. He is navigating the steep incline at the corner of California and DuPont Streets, which is today known as Grant Avenue, right on the border of Chinatown. And suddenly, his heart gives out. He collapses onto the wet pavement.
A crowd, recognizing him instantly, surges forward. Someone desperately shouts for a carriage to rush him to the city-receiving hospital, but the physiological failure is absolute. Emperor Norton dies there on the street corner before any medical intervention can arrive.
The news of his death moves through the city with incredible velocity, and the immediate aftermath provides a heartbreaking, visceral reminder of the stark duality of his existence. Because when the authorities transport his body to the morgue, protocol dictates that they must inventory the contents of his pockets.
The resulting inventory is a tragic distillation of his life.
We spend so much time discussing the free theater tickets, the homemade currency being honored, the grand decrees. It is easy to get swept up in the magic of it and forget how terrifyingly precarious his day-to-day survival actually was. When they empty the pockets of his uniform, they find approximately $5 in actual legal tender.
Right.
They find a handful of worthless, defunct bonds. And they find a meticulously curated collection of what you can only describe as imperial treasures.
These were artifacts that held incalculable value within his internal psychological reality, but absolutely zero value in the empirical world. Among these items were elaborate fabricated telegrams that he had carefully drafted to himself, purportedly sent by the Tsar of Russia, formally congratulating Norton on his impending marriage to Queen Victoria.
It is profoundly poignant detail. It violently punctures the whimsical narrative and reminds us that beneath the civic affection, he was a deeply unwell man living on the absolute precipice of ruin. He wasn't residing in a palace. He was surviving on the sporadic charity of a few kind souls, sleeping in a tiny, drafty room. In every measurable legal sense, he died a pauper.
And because he died entirely destitute, with no known relatives to claim the remains, the bureaucratic machinery prepared to process him accordingly. The standard municipal plan was to place his body in a cheap, unadorned pine box and bury him in a mass pauper's grave at the city's expense.
Right.
The institutional reality was finally going to claim him.
But the city of San Francisco refused to allow the story to end that way. They intercepted the bureaucracy. When the members of the Pacific Club, an exclusive organization comprised of the city's wealthiest, most powerful capitalists and civic leaders, learned that the emperor was destined for a pauper's grave, they intervened immediately.
They did.
They opened their own accounts and purchased a magnificent, heavy rosewood casket fitted with ornate silver hardware. They assumed complete control of the arrangements to ensure a dignified, majestic funeral.
The scale of the city's final act of devotion is staggering, even by modern standards. The funeral was held on January 10th. While historical accounts naturally vary regarding the exact crowd size, every metric agrees it was an overwhelming city-stopping event. Estimates place the number of mourners somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 people.
30,000 people. In a city the size of 1880 San Francisco, that is a massive percentage of the total population turning out for the funeral of a homeless man.
It really is.
The procession to the Masonic Cemetery stretched out for over 2 miles. And it wasn't just the elite in carriages. It was a complete cross-section of the city. Wealthy bankers, dock workers, immigrants, families, politicians, and police officers. They all lined the muddy streets, standing in silence, removing their hats in genuine respect as the rosewood casket passed by.
The San Francisco Chronicle, which is one of the most powerful and widely read papers on the West Coast, ran a simple, devastatingly effective headline on its front page to announce his passing. They did not resort to mockery. They didn't label him a vagrant or a madman. The headline, printed in bold, respectful type, simply read,
Le roi est mort.
"The king is dead."
Exactly.
They granted him the royal exit that his internal reality demanded. And while his physical reign concluded on that rainy street corner, his cultural resonance was only just beginning to calcify. You cannot have a figure this singular operating in a city teeming with writers and artists without his essence bleeding into the literature of the era. The literary epos are significant. Mark Twain, for instance, lived and worked as a young journalist in San Francisco during the very early years of Norton's imperial reign. Twain was intimately familiar with the social fabric of the city and almost certainly encountered the emperor on the streets.
Oh, absolutely.
It is widely analyzed and generally believed, though we must acknowledge Twain never definitively confirmed it in his own autobiographical writings, that Twain modeled the character of the king in his masterwork, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, directly on the grandiose, shabby-genteel delusion of Emperor Norton.
Yeah, when you read Huck Finn, the king possesses that exact same absolute, unyielding insistence on his royal prerogative, despite being dressed in rags and floating on a raft. It's a precise psychological profile Norton projected.
Right.
And the influence extends beyond Twain. Robert Louis Stevenson, the brilliant author of Treasure Island, spent considerable time in San Francisco and actually embedded Emperor Norton as a direct character in his 1892 novel, The Wrecker.
Stevenson captured the duality of the man beautifully in his prose. He described Norton as a portly, rather flabby man with the face of a gentleman, rendered unspeakably pathetic and absurd by the great saber at his side and the peacock's feather in his hat.
Wow.
Stevenson understood that the magic of Norton lay exactly in that friction between the deep pathos of his reality and the soaring absurdity of his delusion.
And his presence hasn't faded. More than a century later, he remains a patron saint of the weird, beautiful soul of San Francisco. There are plaques dedicated to him, establishments bear his name, and there are ongoing, highly passionate, organized campaigns to officially rename the Bay Bridge, the specific massive infrastructure project he literally ordered into existence in his honor.
Which forces us to evaluate the ultimate meaning of this narrative. When you look back across the entire arc of Joshua Norton's life, from the fortune to the shatter to the 21-year reign, it is very easy to get distracted by the aesthetic eccentricity.
Yeah, the fun stuff.
Right, we tend to focus on the beaver hat, the homemade 50-cent notes, the decrees banning political parties. But the true, enduring legacy of Joshua Norton is not the costume he wore. The profound legacy of this story is the imaginative, collective generosity of the thousands of people who decided to maintain the illusion.
It is the story of the audience, not just the actor. So, what does this all mean for us? We began this deep dive looking for a moment of human whimsy. But the architecture of this story is far more robust than that.
Definitely.
This is not a world-shaking geopolitical event. No actual empires collapsed. No wars were decided by his decrees. It was, at its core, a small, highly localized, profoundly beautiful action that a community executed.
A rough, money-hungry, hyper-competitive boomtown, a violent place where individuals routinely murdered each other over mining claims and succumbed to horrific, systemic racial prejudices, managed to achieve a moment of collective grace.
Yeah.
They looked at a penniless, psychologically broken man and decided he was not a nuisance to be eradicated or institutionalized. They decided he was a human being to be cherished and protected.
They had every legal and institutional right to lock him away in 1867. They could have let Officer Barbier's arrest stand. They could have allowed the asylum to consume him. It would have been the easy, rational, legally sanctioned thing to do.
Right.
But they consciously chose to reject the normal response. They chose the abnormal path of kindness.
And that choice is the crucial takeaway. This history proves that a society possesses the capacity, if it consciously chooses to exercise it, to hold and protect the individuals who cannot fit into the prescribed mold. We often discuss the rigid, bureaucratic rules of modern society, the economy, the legal system, the social norms, as if they are immovable laws of physics.
But they aren't.
They are not. We invented them. And just as San Francisco collectively invented a reality to accommodate Emperor Norton, a society can always choose to bend its reality to accommodate the fragile, the broken, and the eccentric. The real magic of the Norton era was not the decrees he wrote. The actual power he yielded was the specific, localized kindness he managed to extract from a hardened city.
He had zero structural power to command them, yet he inspired them to perform the best version of themselves. Which leaves me, and you, with a final thought to examine as we close out this deep dive. Look around at your own modern community. Think about the eccentric individuals, the people who talk to themselves on the subway, the marginalized voices who clearly do not fit the highly productive, optimized, and rigid mold of 21st century existence. Our modern reflex is almost universally to look away, to cross the street, to call security, or to let the institutions handle it.
Yeah.
San Francisco didn't just tolerate their local eccentric, they actively, financially, and socially participated in his reality in order to grant him dignity. What would our communities look like today if we stopped demanding that every single person perfectly conform to our shared, rigid reality and instead just occasionally chose the imaginative generosity of stepping into theirs?